right, welcome back to the podcast. Today we have a very special guest on. 24 years of service in the Army, 16 years in special operations, 14 combat deployments, the executive director of the nonprofit Legend of the 75th, the host of the podcast Legend of the 75th, and is also currently, I would say, creator, producer of the film Journey to Cabanthian. That's still yeah, exactly. I knew I was going to jack it up. Right. Mike Burke, appreciate you coming on the Nine Line Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, man. It's definitely an honor.
No, this is great. I mean, we talked, we got linked up through John from Vet TV, and I'm excited to have you on. I know we had a little conversation before we hopped on this call. So yeah, I mean, I mean, man, you have a hell of a career. So, we definitely dive in, I'd like to cover your career for a little bit. This is, you got something that's very exceptional here, 24 years. And, obviously you were through the thick of it, 14 combat deployments to the GWOT. There's a few things that I've worked with Rangers over the years, and I had no idea what Rangers did. I come from the Marine Corps, so my extent was like, oh, Black Hawk Down. But even then I just didn't know, we just like Marine Corps, we have blinders on them. Like at one point I remember them offering Ranger school, and I was like, what? Like what kind of incentive? It's not a Marine Corps school. I'm like, can you send me to Urban Sniper? Can you send me to Mountain Sniper? Like, they're like, we can give you Ranger school. I'm like, what the hell would I want Ranger school? And but years later, it was awesome running into Rangers and then actually finding out what they did, and then also how you guys developed over the GWOT. It's actually pretty fucking impressive for,
trust me, I made a podcast about it.
Exactly.
Pretty much what we talked about. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, the Marine Corps can hang their hat on, development with tactics, and MARSOC was our big development. But I think, for people that have, or for units that have like really come into their own, after learning, working with Rangers, just after my time in, like, honestly, the Rangers, it feels like you guys probably had almost everybody in the GWOT a giant jump in what your capabilities are, what you guys can do, the kind of the responsibilities that you guys took on. So yeah, we'll first of all, we'll jump into that, but we'll get into, what got you to join, and, what year was that?
Yeah. So it was 1998 is when I joined. I did the delayed entry program out of Sydney, Montana. So what I always tell people about where I live in Montana is, I talk about the mountains and how beautiful they are, and the lakes and the streams and the fly fishing, and people get all excited, and I'm like, keep on driving. And then I'm like, and then it starts to flatten out. I'm like, keep on driving. And then it starts to get really, really flat. Keep on driving. And then you start to hit the agricultural part, and you're like, what is going on here? Am I still in Montana? That's where I live. Right on the border in North Dakota. So, it's hard living out there. It's a hard life out there. I mean, most of Montana is. But, really the accelerant for me joining the Army was very simple. There's not a lot of options. Unless, you have a family that owns a lot of land, is involved in the farming and the agricultural or any other industries that are out there. It's blue collar work, and there's nothing wrong with that. I just, I grew up doing that, working all different kinds of jobs. So, that was the option. I could go work in the oil fields. That's a very popular thing out there too. And it's actually, even more so than when I was growing up. They're, going through an oil boom with all the fracking and everything else going on. And I really didn't like that option either. And then the third option was, sell drugs, which, I could continue to do that. But I really just, I knew that I wanted something different. I kind of had an epiphany moment. I don't claim to be a very smart guy. In fact, I'm usually the dumbest person in the room. But when I was 17, I was at a kegger, and I'm watching all these kids, we're partying, we're having fun, we got the bonfire going on, it's in a field, it's Montana, much like most of us were doing back then. And then, these these vehicles show up, these trucks, and it was mostly trucks. That's what everybody drove in Montana. And, these kids, these guys that are like 20, 22, 23, 24, they start hopping out, they're partying, and they're trying to like steal our girls and all this different kind of stuff. And I just remember I had this moment like, this is me. if I don't do something that's like really, really going to change the trajectory of my life, this is what my life's going to be. And I'm not mad at any of those people, and I don't look down on them, but I just knew that I wanted something different. I knew that there had to be a different pathway. In the military, you know, I come from very humble beginnings, and the military was the quickest way out of the town and the most stable paycheck. And oh, by the way, you know, you get to have all the adventure. You know, we've all seen the recruiting videos. I mean, the 90 recruit videos. I mean, come on. Like, does it get any better than that, right?
Yeah, we had the lava monster, bro. I know exactly how it is.
You guys had the lava monster, and I'll tell you the Marine Store story in a second. You know, we had, you know, the guys jumping out of the back of the plane. You know, we do more before 5 a.m. than most people do all day, you know, and he's sitting on the airfield, you know, all this different kind of stuff, you know. And so I was just like, well, I guess I'm going to join the military. And I thought about the Marines. You know, I talked to the Marines as well. I talked to, you know, both recruiters. I looked in the National Guard for an option, and I was like, oh boy, you know, I definitely don't want to do that. And, you know, so went to, you know, MEPS, just like many of us do. And they're, you know, and I said, hey, I want to be an airborne ranger. And they're like, yeah, that's not going to happen. Like, there's no options for that. You can't just join and go to the, you know, Ranger Regiment. It doesn't work that way. And I was like, well, I do know differently. You can. And, you know, I can't remember what it was called. It might have still been called an Option 40 contract. I don't really remember. Back then, I was like, you get me that, or, you know, I'm walking away. And I was like, in fact, I've been talking to the Marines. So I went in there and I sat down with this gunny. I had a great conversation, man. He was the nicest guy, you know, and we just talked, and like, he got me like a cup of coffee, you know, donut, all this different kind of stuff. And we're talking about, you know, being in the Marine Corps and, you know, what that would look like. And then, yeah, so I was sitting there for a while, and then, you know, the Army recruiter came back in. He's like, okay, I think we can figure this out. And I was like, well, hey, thanks for the cup of coffee, Gunny. And I like pop smoke. And I went and I signed it. Now, they didn't give me an Option 40 contract, but they gave me an airborne contract. And I knew that I would have the opportunity to volunteer at airborne school. So, you know, yeah, went to basic training. That was pretty boring. You know, I didn't really find that terribly exciting. It was definitely a culture shock, you know, going from Montana. The only time I traveled out of Montana is like once or twice to like California to visit, you know, family. But really than that, I hadn't traveled. And so I get off the plane, you know, in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm like, well, I guess this is where I die, because that humidity hit my face. It was June, you know, of 98. I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be terrible. And, you know, but, you know, suffered through it, made it through it. Basic airborne school was very, very interesting. It hurt significantly, you know, running so slow and jumping out of planes all the time. And the swingland trainer, or, you know, jumping off the platforms and all that different kind of stuff, broke my tailbone because somebody let me go on the swingland trainer, you know, and I smacked up against a platform. But, you know, you suck it up. And I hounded the shit out of the the Ranger liaison that was down in our airborne school. And, you know, they did the brief, and, you know, I went up afterwards, you know, I think it was like the second week, and I was like, hey, you know, Private Burke, you know, Sergeant, you know, I want to go to Ranger Regiment. He's like, I almost don't want to let you, because you've left me so many notes. You know, you've been, you know, knocking on my door, you know, all this different kind of stuff. But he's like, you know, here, just be here, you know, after graduation and everything else. So, you know, went to, you know, did RASP, it was RIP back in the day. You know, that was a suck fest. You know, it's 3 weeks. Now it's 8 weeks, but it was 3 weeks, and it was just about, you know, kicking your ass. To be honest with you, it was what I thought basic training was going to be. But, you know, basic training really wasn't that. And, you know, and got to 275 in October of 98. So that's the long and the short of it, of when I joined and how I joined.
Yeah. That's, like I said, back, and that's the 90s. So you had some pretty good, like, who kind of let you in on like the Ranger secret thing? Cause you're like, I know how to do this. Like, none of us do, you know, we're like, I think they'll do that. Like, did you know somebody that was like, no. Like, cause if we, you know, the way things work now, if someone's like, hey, my son's thinking about, like, look, I know, I don't know the Army as much, but like, I could be like, I'll tell you how to get to Ranger. I'll tell you how to get the SF. I'll tell you how to get the Delta. You know what I mean? Like, the information's so much out there that we can find it. Be like, no, don't let them lie to you. You'll figure it out, you know? But I mean, it's 98, you know, you know, Before we keep going with the podcast, I want to drop this week's discount code for 9 Line Apparel. We're not just a brand, we're a lifestyle that celebrates the spirit of freedom, courage, and American values. Go check out our gear, including hoodies, glassware, flags, jackets, hats, patches, and much more. All material is ethically sourced, so every shirt you buy is free of slave labor. As a veteran-owned and operated company, we also take pride in giving back to those who've served. Your purchase helps us contribute to charitable initiatives supporting veterans and first responders. This episode's discount code is RLTW20 for 20% off Nine Line Apparel products. Romeo, Lima, Tango, Whiskey, 20. Not 10, not 15, 20%. Not 25 because that's a bit excessive. So get over to the store and get yourself 20% off your next purchase. While you're at it, like, listen, and subscribe to the Nine Line Apparel Podcast for future discount codes and more conversations with amazing guests like today. Now back to the podcast.
So I always laugh when I tell this story, and I'm glad that you picked that up. You know, sometimes I hesitate to tell the story, but basically I joined the Army and I joined Ranger Regiment off of Walleye. Mm-hmm. So I had a relative that had proclaimed that he was in Ranger Regiment, which he was. He just wasn't there very long. Mm-hmm. That lasted a couple months. So he came home and, you know, the black beret, the old green uniform, you know, green dress mess, you know, or not dress mess, but the green, you know, class A's that we used to have. You know, he looked amazing, you know, with the jump boots. I mean, still to this day, jump boots. I mean, come on, you know, it doesn't get any sexier than that, you know? And, you know, so that's how I had a little bit of the inside baseball. And I actually also had a First Sergeant Sorensen, who was actually in charge of the National Guard unit. There was actually a field artillery unit that was located in my hometown. Not anymore, but it was at the time. And he was actually really knowledgeable, you know, about different things. He's like, and he basically told me what a lot of guys learned the hard way. He's like, recruiters are going to lie to you. Tell them what you want. They'll figure it out. Don't take no for an answer. Don't sign anything. You want to be an 11 Bravo. This is what you want to do. Stick to your guns. They can make it happen. They're just being lazy, you know, and they don't want to do the additional paperwork. Because, you know, back in the day, it wasn't an email. It wasn't, you know, there wasn't some centralized, you know, system they could get on to figure that stuff out. You know, they had to make phone calls. They had to, you know, fill out paperwork and fax stuff, you know. So, you know, so I did have a couple people that really kind of mentored me. I didn't know what I was getting into. I will say that. Like, no one didn't really kind of understand that nor have an appreciation for that. But, you know, you think about it as a 17, 18-year-old kid, would we have listened anyway? And the answer is no.
Yeah. I mean, that's good. That's awesome though, that somebody was like, hey, you know, like said, even, you know, going that route of like, hey, stick with it. You know, I was just hard headed where I was like, I just want to be infantry, you know, and that's not a hard path. You know what I mean? It's like they offered me other stuff. I was like, no, I want to be a grunt, you know? So, you know, I think it's sometimes a little harder when I have guys ask me, they're like, hey, I heard there's a contract for Marine Scout Sniper. I was like, that's a lie. That's not real. You know, you know, especially in the Marine Corps, there isn't a lot of, I think, recon, but even recon, it's just like, it just guarantees you a tryout slot, which I'm sure, which is like Rangers, you know, I think now with RASP, you know,
Ranger,
it's like, hey, we can
do Zulu program, all that stuff.
We can get you to the tryout, but that's about as far as we go, you know, or whatever. Yeah. Can't get you to the school, but yeah, that's wild. So you get in at 98, you're pre 9/11, you know, everything, you know, how was life like in the regiment then? And, you know, that turn happens, you know, what was that like?
Yeah. You know, so I'm when I talk about my period from 98 to, you know, 2001, I'm jealous of a lot of guys, you know, that I've served with, my peer group and other guys that served in Ranger Regiment, because they talk about, you know, their first leaders, you know, their team leaders, squad leaders, platoon sergeants, all this stuff. And, you know, they talk about them like they're gods. Like, those are the guys that set the foundations for who they would become later in life. I did not have that experience. I was literally the guy that was in the platoon that had a nickname that basically translated into the unprofessional platoon, the full, you know, full of a bunch of brigands and hooligans. You know, they were more concerned about, you know, they literally, instead of like a training calendar, like in our squad room, they had a calendar that showed where they could go and get free drinks at the bar every night. And, you know, and it was ridiculous. And I was really, really disheartened. You know, and I became the guy very quickly. I had some fortunate opportunities to do some really cool training, like even Ranger School itself. I got to go to Ranger School because my platoon sergeant, Nick the Bod Rolling, which he's a great guy. Definitely, you know, he probably would have, he actually could play a Marine in a movie, because he definitely has like that, you know, that stout, short little kind of composure and the way he talks, you know, real gruff, you know. He definitely could have played a Marine in a movie. But anyway, the point is, all the privates were, because the way it works in Ranger Regiment is you basically prove yourself, and within the first year and a half, you get a slot to go to Ranger School. If you prove yourself that you have the potential, because you have the potential, you have the physical ability and the mental ability and everything else, because once you come back from Ranger School, you're going in a leadership position. It might just be a gun team leader, but it might be like a team leader position most of the times. So they got to see that potential there. And all these privates were failing the Ranger School PT test. They weren't passing it to go to Ranger School. And I remember I'm sitting in the hallway and the iron chair, all the privates are, because we messed something up. So mass punishment is always the best leadership philosophy, right? And he's yelling at the squad leaders about the Ranger School PT test. And he literally, yells at them, and they're kind of yelling back. They're getting in this argument. And he's like, you know what? I'm picking the next guy that's going to Ranger School PT test. And he comes out, and at that moment, I was like in the perfect 90-degree angle, holding the iron chair, 2 standard, can of Copenhagen on the leg and everything else, and looked like I wasn't sucking, which was unusual, because I'm not a physical specimen by any means. And he's like, Burke, you're taking the PT test. I'd only been in Ranger Regiment 6 months. So it was very unusual. And I had privates that had been there almost 2 years, and everybody freaked out. They're like, you can't send Burke. He just got here. He's retarded, all this different kind of stuff. And he's like, nope, I made my decision. He called the first sergeant. He's like, Ranger Burke's freaking taking the Ranger School slot for 2nd platoon on the next PT test. And that PT test was going to be Monday. And bottom line,
was there a reason why? Was it the 90s where there's just not a lot of schools picking up, or like you said, guys between 2 years and
No, I mean, battalions only get so many slots, and I don't know what the allocation was back then, but usually a company only got maybe 3 to 5 slots, and there's a lot of people that want to go to Ranger School, especially in the 90s when that's the only thing we had to focus on. During the GWOT, that was a little bit different. There was a lot of slots because a lot of people didn't want to go to Ranger School from outside Ranger Regiment across the Army. They just, because they're deploying all the time. I mean, who can blame them, right? Who wants to come back from a deployment, go spend 4 months in Ranger School, probably come back, do a training cycle, part of a training cycle, and then deploy again, especially if you're married, that even makes it more difficult, and we had to really kind of think about that when we would send guys. But make a long story short, man, they did everything they possibly could to make sure that I wouldn't pass the Ranger School PT test. I mean, the hazing was pretty epic. I dislocated my shoulder falling off the ropes because I reached muscle failure. And I stood in line, getting ready to take the Ranger School PT test, and I was just like, I didn't care. I got to be honest with you. I was so smoked. I was just exhausted. I was like, there's no way I'm passing this PT test. And I just remember this private behind me, we were kind of talking just a little bit, and, he was just like so excited, and he was so, it was such an honor for him to be able to go take the Ranger School PT test. And I remember I was like a little bit jealous that was his mentality, and my mentality was like very broken. And I just remember thinking like, hey, there's no way I'm gonna let these fuckers win. And I don't really honestly remember anything. I kind of just went into the zone moment, like pushed through it, did my push-ups, did my sit-ups, ran the fastest run I've ever ran, probably on the 2-miler. And I just remember coming across the finish line, at the end, and I knew I'd passed. And one of my team leaders was standing there, my squad leader was standing there, and one of the other Tab Spec 4s was standing there too, guy named Matt Nyman. And I crossed the finish line and, go, get the name, on the PT, card and everything else. And then I walk over, they're like, okay, go fall in with, your leadership. And I just remember Matt looked at me and he goes, if you can pull that off, there's nothing you can't do in the Army. He's like, there's no reason you should have passed that PT test. In fact, we were trying to make sure you didn't, because we're all pissed off, And so the point is it was a very valuable lesson for me of what you can accomplish when your mind's in something, and how you can push further than you. Because I was broke, man. I'd quit. I mean, in my mind, I'd quit. I didn't care. I didn't care. I was going to go. Shit, I didn't even think I was going to get down and actually do the push-ups because my shoulder was in so much pain. I mean, it was screaming at me, and, push through it. And the other valuable lesson is I was like, every storm passes and you just got to push through it, and I came back from Ranger School, put in a leadership position, had some, better leaders. And then there was a huge shakeup in the platoon. And, shortly, so I still was a guy with the calendar on the wall, counting down the days till I ETS. And they shook up the platoon, they shook up the whole company, and they brought over this squad leader named Master Sergeant Josh Wheeler. And that guy changed everything. Literally changed my entire philosophy about being a man, being a leader, what it meant to do all those things, and, what it meant to be an airborne ranger. And, so you fast forward, 6 months after that guy came, I was the guy with the calendar. I had like less than a year left in the Army. 6 months later, I'm a new promoted sergeant. And I just re-enlisted for another 4 years, and I couldn't imagine doing anything else with my life, and it was one guy that took that, to do that for me. I mean, he literally changed my entire perspective, leading my personal example, train, some of the things that he left me with was, every time you train like it's the last time you go to combat. Every time you do PT, do it like it's the last time you go to combat. Be an expert. Know what, as a leader, you can't afford to be exhausted. Perfection's unattainable, but that's always what you're, in the pursuit of. And, this is about, 2000 time frame. Fast forward a little bit, and then we're in Germany and the towers fall. And we're doing a training exercise out there. And then, 375 jumps into Rhino. We watched that, unfortunately, saw that in the newspapers. We're all pissed off. We're like, we were in Germany. Why didn't they take us? Like, we were closer, 175, they deployed. Roberts Ridge happened. They lost all those guys and, lost, the PJ, the SEALs, all that stuff that happened there. And then we deployed. And it was off to the races after that. I mean, it was non-freaking stop, for the next, 11 years.
And then did you guys, I always like asking this question to guys. I do love the Army because and this is even my latter years. I was in the National Guard, but the options that the Army gives you, and a Marine Corps infantry, love the fact that I'm infantry, but there's so many options and stuff. Was there like, even in the 90s, did you guys have, like I said, you're like, that leadership changed you, but was there like stuff too in your mind, like, well, there's more to this than, like what's going on, like the intelligence assets, Delta, like the fact that you could be like that asset over there, and did you guys have some of those like Black Hawk Down veteran, I'm sure that was in your guys' ether, so it feels like the Army just like, once you get into that, ether, that they're like, oh yeah, there's like, dude, you can go here, you go here, you go here, like you can maneuver. And then obviously after 9/11, but does that feel like, like I said, you're off to the races, you re-enlisted. Was there something like the next step for you that was like, what, I think I'm going to try this, or just I'm going to stick out with Ranger Regiment, until something pops off, or, was there like an incentive for you? Like, I don't know, jump school, or not say jump school, but like, something else,
Yeah. In the 90s, and kind of the mentality, and I fault myself for this, I didn't really have an appreciation for all the opportunities that were out there. I mean, I got to do a lot of awesome schools, I really did. But, I wasn't a guy that was, kind of hunting that stuff. Like I was just trying to kind of like figure out my job. I mean, I did do stuff, and I really got into demolitions. And I have Chris Moore and, Mark Griff to thank for that, because in Ranger Regiment, you also have additional specialties that you pick up. Some guys are, really get into marksmanship and go to all the marksmanship schools and really focus on that stuff, so that when you do training there, everybody's got levels of expertise, but these guys, they'll spend additional time and they go to additional schools for that stuff. There's guys that, medical, EMT certifications, doing additional medical, training, all this different kind of stuff. And then, there's demolitions as well, and, structural breaching, urban breaching, heavy breaching, and all the different, not only explosives, but manual thermal, that guys will use, that we'll use for that different kind of stuff. And that's really what kind of captivated me. And I went to a lot of amazing schools. I was actually part of the very first cohorts of Rangers, and then, even some of the special operations guys, they got to go do, advanced structural breaching with the NSA. And, we're literally in downtown freaking Las Vegas, with hotels, abandoned hotels, and spending 2 weeks there, just testing out demolitions and different kinds of charges and everything else, and I just love that stuff. Yeah. But again, my mind frame in those early years it was cool. It was fun, but it's just like, I was so tainted that I was like, I'm not really in it for the long haul. I'm going to do this and then I'm out. But then after Josh, and then, more to your kind of point, that's when really, things, changed in my mentality. And I started asking myself the question, hey, what's out there? What's out there for my guys that I can send guys to, cause you got Pathfinder, you got Air Assault, you got Halo School, Scuba School, which I actually went to pre-scuba. Unfortunately, I was not recommended. So I didn't get to go to actual scuba school. Shallow blackwater or blackouts too many times. So I didn't get to go there. But SEER school, all this different kind of stuff. It's out there. I mean, the Army is the training bed for a lot of different schools. And sniper school even, but we even, in the day we used to send guys to Marine sniper school or Scout sniper school and, some of the recon schools that you guys had, until we kind of built up a lot of those different, abilities and kind of platforms. And then, Marines even started coming. But like, if you want to go to airborne school, it doesn't matter what branch you're in. You come to our airborne school. Like, you come to the Army's airborne school, and I actually went to airborne school with a bunch of Marines that were in my platoon. Because, the Army is the biggest, the Marine Corps is small, the opportunities and some of that stuff and the justification for having these different schools, it's a little bit harder. But, the Army, when you consider the Army itself, the National Guard component, the reserve component, and then all the support they do internationally and international agreements that we have, with other countries, and the other branches that we also support with some of our schooling, you're talking millions of people that can attend all these schools every single year, So, but then, also kind of what you were saying too, I didn't really learn this, but, I started telling guys as I grew up as a leader, in the Army that, that we're saying, hey, I want to, I'm thinking about getting out. I'm thinking about getting out after this enlistment. And I stopped talking guys into reenlistment. I didn't talk to guys about reenlistment. I talked to them about options. And, what were they going to do if they wanted to go into the civilian world? What would that mean? National Guard, Reserve, or maybe even cross, I had guys that went, into the Coast Guard, wanted to do, rescue swimming in Coast Guard or become a PJ. I had guys that became PJs for the Air Force because for whatever reason, that just really kind of allured to them. Or that wanted to do something different in the Army. They just didn't like what they were doing in the Army, or maybe it wasn't really kind of satisfying that itch, but they wanted to go be a pilot. They wanted to go be a warrant officer, in some other kind of capacity. They wanted to go to SF because that really kind of alerted to them in the mission that, that SF has, or they wanted to go to Delta Force. The options are really, really, truly unlimited. And when you talk to guys about reenlisting or staying in, don't limit the options just to the job that you're doing and climbing that ladder. There's a million opportunities out there. Shit. Nowadays, or even when I was coming up, you could technically like get out of the Army and go to grad school, and become a doctor. I mean, I have some of my best friends are PAs now, and they did that after their enlisted time. They got out of the Army for 4 to 5 years, went to, become MDs, and now they're PAs in the military, or even in different branches. Or you want to be a lawyer, you can do the same thing. You literally get out of the Army, you're on National Guard status, you report to an ROTC unit, and you can go and study to be a lawyer for 4 or 5 years. The Army's going to pay it, and you have a 6-year obligation on the back. And it just continues to expand. It continues to get better because the military as a whole is trying to in-house a lot of those skills and those expertise because cost effective. It just makes more sense than some civilian contractor. And when you have sequesters and everything else, that can make life, really challenging.
Mm-hmm. No, and like I said, that's good to hear because it's, after my years of experience, like dealing with the Army National Guard, or like going through the GWOT era, I was a contractor as well,
Yeah.
It's, you see, it like opens up, it's like, and Marine Corps is the worst of it, it's like, we're very blinders, like I said, finding out like what the options were in the Army, was like mind shattering when I went to Afghanistan, my third pump. We worked with contractors. We were on our own, but we worked with we got a National Guard mortar team attached to us. I was attached to active duty SF 10th group. and then we had 20th group we worked with on ops, and then we also had a major that turned into our team leader from 19th group. So it was like this hodgepodge, and it was just like talking to these guys. Oh, they're like, especially the Georgia boys from National Guard. They're like, you can do anything, man. They're like, hey, and they were great. And they were like, oh, you can do this, we can do this. And I was like, oh my God. And you talk with the SF guys, and they're all like, half of them are Marines, especially the Guard guys. They're all like, oh yeah, man. I contracted, and then I went to selection. Don't worry about, and so you just have these options. And, I think that's why I do give the Army a lot of credit, especially in those years when you're talking with guys too. It's like, well, what do you want to do? What would you like to do? If the Army can help, it can help. I mean, Marine Corps, they're like, you're too stupid to go. You only got a high school education. Well, you got kids now. What are you going to do? You can't get a job outside.
Does the Marine Corps offer like GED improvement programs, or ASVAB improvement programs and stuff like that?
They started to, but that was the hard part though, was like the aspect of like we deployed so much, especially in the height of the GWOT, and then on top of it, it was just kind of like there was a very small window where they were offering so much money in like 07. It's like 07, 08, actually really it. And I couldn't, I wasn't planning on staying in by any means, but it was just very much like, you're at the mercy of the Marine Corps. The thing that goes around with the Marine Corps, the saying is like, the Marine Corps tells me where to go and I go, that's very much the mentality. Like, well, the Marine Corps needs me here. That's where I got to go, and infantry is, the most depressing because it's your best 4 years or your first 4 years. Yeah. You don't really, it's like a very rare, that my peer group, got lucky on the aspect of like re-enlistment bonuses were like, if you would like to stay in a Victor unit, like our deployable units, and go fight, it was one of the few times I've ever seen that they were like, here's 30 grand. You'll go over to 6 Marines, 7 Marines, or whatever. They're deploying. So you're going to go to helm, so it was like, you could keep deploying, but then after those 7 years, it's like, now you're screwed. Now it's, you turn down B billets. So you're not getting promoted. Yeah. I knew guys that had like Navy crosses and they won't get promoted because they didn't go to the drill field. They just kept, they did like 4 deployments in a row. So you're just like, it's just one of those things where it's just not, that you're at the mercy of the Marine Corps opposed to like, I look at the Army and the Army's like, well, what would you like to do? How can we have you stay in? And I love that. I think that's great.
That's literally what our recruiters, I would tell my guys, before they would go talk to the career counselors, like, hey, to formulate those options, say, well, I'm thinking about staying in the Army, but I definitely don't want to stay in Ranger Regiment. And they're going to, they just want you to sign. So they're going to turn over heaven and earth, and I don't know the count. It's definitely over the 100 MOSs that are available in the Army. I mean, it's pretty earth shattering when you actually look at it, like the MOSs that are available, within the Army. And, becoming an officer is an option as well. I mean, but the Army, it's just larger. Yeah. It's not that it's any better than the Marine Corps. If the Marine Corps was the same size, it would be it'd be the same way, but I will say this, the Marine Corps, I always loved working with the Marine Corps because, there's something to be said for that. Well, I'm going to do what the Marine Corps tells me to do, but there's also this just like, and that's what Ranger Regiment and the Marine Corps share in common is the tight-knit nature of the Marine Corps is a lot like Ranger Regiment, the culture of it. I mean, even Rangers will say, they stole the line, from the Marine Corps, once a Ranger, always a Ranger. I mean, and it's true, it's really true. And, there's a lot of different reasons for that. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more as we kind of get.
Yeah. So no, it's all good. So GWOT starts kicking off. Where were you? You said that first. So as that first pump, then in Afghanistan are you 275 or what was your?
I was in 275. Yep.
Okay. So what was that like getting in, like I said, those first guys get in, Anaconda happens, Roberts Ridge. I think that's Anaconda. And then you guys, and then it's like not further after that, that's the invasion of Iraq. I mean, it kicks off, Yeah. What was that op tempo? What was the, how was it? And you're kind of you're a senior guy. So you're kind of,
I was a team leader, but it was a good time to be a team leader. I will say that. I was very lucky. Yeah. So, the first deployment to Afghanistan, it was interesting because they were kind of trying to figure out what we were going to do. And I don't just mean, Rangers. I mean, like everybody, like now, okay, we've pushed a lot of the Taliban out. We've done a lot of the fighting. Like, how are we going to stabilize this country? What is it going to look for? How are we going to find these additional guys, that are out there that are holed up, that are across the Pakistan border? So there was just a lot of moving around and a lot of changes like, oh, hey, we're going to do this, and there was a little bit of still the Rangers supporting, Delta Force or, SEAL Team 6, and, the kind of the BP operations. There was still some of that going on. So that first deployment, it was good because, we did a lot of different things, but it wasn't it wasn't like a deployment like later on, where we were in gunfights, every night, and, just rolling through. We were moving around a lot. We were going to different FOBs. I mean, we set up a lot of 275 set up a lot of the FOBs that became large FOBs later on. Wara, Skin. I'm trying to I can't remember the other one, but there was like 3 or 4 that we actually set up, because they were going, okay, these are strategic strong points that we need to have elements in, so we went and we literally, built up these, forward operating bases and then, did patrols out of there, either mounted or dismounted, but what were we looking for? We hadn't, we trained, to fight, near peer or people that, were carrying weapons and look like an enemy, not people that, are farming out in the field and then grabbing a rifle at night. That was kind of new, so, the first deployment, I want to say, was anticlimactic. There was a couple, interesting nights, but for the most part, it wasn't what I thought it was going to be, that first deployment. But then, fast forward less than a year, when we get back from that deployment, we go through the training cycle, we stop the training cycle, like, hey, okay, we're doing loadout, like what's going on? We're going back to Afghanistan. No, we're not going back to Afghanistan, all this different kind of stuff. And then before we knew it, we were in RR, Saudi Arabia for, setting up. And we really didn't even totally know what was going on because that's how far ahead my company was from, when we showed up to RR, there was some CBs, and maybe like another support element of some kind. And that was it. We literally set up the tents that we slept in that first night. And then for a month, 3 weeks, we just set up tents. We were setting up tents, and then, RR became a huge hub. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of people. There was planes coming in like every, 2 to 3 minutes, so C5, C17s, everything you could think of. It just, it was really built out, preparing for the invasion of Iraq. And then, so the original plan was third ID was going to go up and, based off the resistance that they met on the outskirts of Baghdad, then the regiment was going to jump on buyout. And we were going to have an air assault element and, 2 battalions worth of people jumping and doing an airfield seizure, which is one of our signature, things that we have to be able to do on the Baghdad International Airport. But third ID didn't meet the resistance that they thought they did. So literally, we did like pre-jump, we did all this stuff. We were preparing for the airborne operations. We had a couple like QRF missions that we did, kind of prior to that, because, you had recce elements, you had Delta elements and stuff like that, like pushing across, and doing different stuff. Plus we had all different kinds of pilots, from every freaking branch doing all kinds of different shit, so we were always preparing in case something got shot down, we'd have to go and, get those guys. But anyway, third ID basically moved in, sees the airfield, and they're like, nope, airfield's good. Third ID's got it. And so we loaded on the planes, we landed in BIOP, and it was on like Donkey Kong for the next 4 months, hunting out Bath members, looking for, weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, and finishing, the clear out of the cities, finding people that, are still taking up arms or, not only military, but then just, resistance fighters. But it was pretty interesting because, I often talk about that. Like we would go out and we'd do hits and stuff like that. And then we would stop like on the way back and stop in downtown Baghdad, leave somebody on, leave a couple guys on the gun jeeps, ditch all our stuff, take our 9mm and go shopping. Go grab food, and, walk around the town and sightsee and talk to people. They loved us. Man, we were heroes. We liberated their country, and it was a very stark contrast to, how things started to develop over, the next 3 or 4 months. I remember, being back stateside after that deployment, starting to talk about IEDs or starting to talk about the insurgency. And I'm like, in Iraq? I was like, no way. Those people are awesome. They love us there. They wouldn't do some shit like that. And then, we all know how that story went,
Yeah, I know. Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah. And then, so, I mean, invading a country, just to get into that, I mean, I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun.
Looked like it.
Yeah.
I've heard stories.
if you get the opportunity, I definitely recommend it. There's a lot going on. It's a lot of chaos. It's a lot of moving parts. You find yourself just doing all kinds of different things, working with Marines, literally, I mean, we're doing cordon searches, they're blocking off cities, I mean, it's crazy stuff. We're hopping in the back of Bradleys to get to, really contested areas, and then hopping out, hitting buildings and everything else. But that was the first real kind of time where, yeah, sure, there was some platoons that would have to cycle through to do support operations for other special operations unit, but they were just using us like a strike force, and we were going in and we were doing a lot of different stuff, and we were hunting. And we actually, there was a point where Ranger, it was a Ranger platoon that had found the highest number on the deck of cards, because basically it had a deck of cards that they passed out, and it had all the Ba'ath Party members. Obviously, Saddam was the ace of spades, his sons, were the other aces, and then, went down the chain of command. And at the time, Ranger Regiment was actually the guys that had found, the highest, person on the deck of cards. Obviously, they got surpassed, but there was a while there where we're like, holy shit, yeah, we could do this. We can hunt out HVTs too. We can do that. But yeah, it was a lot of fun.
And that aspect too, you guys have like, you're kind of coming to your own with the direct action, hunting down HVTs. Was that something that, I don't want to say it was a secondary for Rangers, but I mean, like I said, they're like feeling you out. Like, you're like, yeah, we can do this. Like we, cause there's so much to go around that you guys are proving yourselves. And then we know how things kind of go. Yeah. I mean, you guys end up becoming, your own entity essentially, down the road, cause I know, like I said, Delta's doing their head SEAL teams, and then you have the SEALs and you have whatever, but Rangers are going out doing these direct action missions. And, did you guys feel like that's where you were developing too? Like, hey, we're going to kind of start taking this on more and more and more.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't really kind of see it at the time, but I mean, there was a lot of different factors that kind of played into it. Growing up in the, the 90s, growing up, and then, you got the 80s guys, and you look like Mogadishu. Rangers had their own specific missions. No one could do an airfield seizure like Ranger Regiment. It just, they just don't have the units that train it on the way that we train it and could do it in a period of darkness. Plenty of units have tried, but they just can't do it, especially when you're talking about a contested zone in the middle of a country that's a large international airport. Like there's no one that can do it like Ranger Regiment. And, so it what, in Ranger raids, like, we could do that stuff, and the firepower that Ranger platoon brings, to the fight, and the effectiveness that they bring into the fight, like all those things were kind of recognizable. But like during the invasion, we really didn't see it, because we were doing so many things. We were doing raids, we were doing this different kind of stuff. We were doing movement conduct drills, dismounted, mounted, and everything else. But, at times it'd be like, hey, this platoon or this squad needs to go, and they got to support, the other special operations unit, because they just don't have the man. They don't have the manpower to secure a whole block, or whatever it is. They just don't have the manpower to do it. It's not about capabilities or anything else. Plus, they don't bring the firepower that a Ranger Regiment a Ranger platoon brings. I mean, you're talking 3 240s, 6 freaking saws, 6, 203s, all the demolitions, all the grenades and everything else, because of the bodies. It's just because of the amount of people they can bring all that stuff. And then, the ability to fire and maneuver because of team leaders, squad leaders, and all this different kind of stuff. Like, it just really is, it really brings something, different to the battle space. But we didn't really see it at the time, because there was just so much going on. Obviously, oh, hey, shit, we're not going on this major, op tonight because my squad or my platoon, we have to go out and support, Delta Force. I'm like, fuck, great, So we did recognize, like, God, we got to, there's these times where we have to play second fiddle. Like, why the hell can't we do this shit, or can't they secure themselves or call the National Guard or, something like that, like, and just to be a dick because we're two veterans here. Call the Marine Corps. They're good at that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But
so,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. No, I was saying, like, so then you guys are, you get to the invasion, and then kicks off. You did 14 combat deployments. So I mean, like, op tempo. I know you guys get into that. Everyone kind of starts getting into that groove. Funding, explodes. What's that evolution like? Looks like 98. Now you're, it's like, I'm sure, I'm imagine it was like no holds bar, like rock and roll.
Yeah. It's amazing to look back at how quickly it really kind of accelerated. And then, kind of how we missed like the major points because we were just involved in it at the time. But so following the invasion, that winter, we went and did something called Winter Surge in Afghanistan. It was looking for bin Laden. They thought that they'd had him, up in the, Hindu Kush and everything else. So they surged the whole goddamn regiment there.
Really? That's a cool story. I've never heard of that.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And then there was additional Marine surges, that they brought in too, Army, everybody. Like, it was a huge surge in the winter. And I just remember this is coming into, like what you're talking about with funding. We really didn't kind of see it before. Like, they gave us some additional stuff, like when we abated, like J-slit sleeves and stuff like that. But that's not sexy stuff. You're like, whatever, fuck, now I got this giant chem suit and I got two of them, I got all this stuff. Like, there wasn't really anything big that we were. But I just remember for Winter Surge, they were like, okay, you guys are going to be out there for a while. We don't have the Army equipment that is going to sustain you guys. It's going to be cold as shit. And the stuff that the Army does have is big, bulky, and you guys don't even be carrying this stuff because you guys got to carry food, got to carry ammo and everything else. And, I don't know the amount, you hear rumors, but basically what we were told was they told the S4 and all the supply sergeants, like, and they grabbed like this huge detail. They went to REI and outdoor research and, because it's Pacific Northwest, so we can get all this shit. Like, we got Patagonia up there. We got all that stuff. They had like $1 million on the government purchase card. And they just bought us all gloves, hats, hand warmers, thermal gear, sleeping bag. I mean, you name it, they got it, and it was just, this stuff just flooded in and we're like, whoa, we're like kids in a candy store, like, look at all this shit, and then you fast forward, we're there and we're like, it's cold. They should have bought us more shit,
Yeah.
But I mean, basically that deployment, we just walked. I mean, we just literally walked. They would drop us or helo us in at the base of valleys and we'd walk up the valley. And I mean, we were doing, presence patrols and searches and everything else in villages at like, 12,000, 14,000 feet. Like, it was ridiculous, and, there was some stuff that happened, on that deployment. There were some serious firefights. Pat Tillman died on that deployment. And then, my good buddy Jay Blessing, he died. He was blown up by an IED as well.
Blessing.
Yeah. So there was, there was some serious stuff that happened. But again, that was just kind of like, here we are just doing Ranger shit, walking, for days on end, walking our asses off. Literally, we all like lost weight like we were back in Ranger school. But we got back from that, and that's really when things pivoted. That's when it started to become noticeable, because now we were dividing between Afghanistan and Iraq. Delta Force, SEAL teams, they were all doing the same thing too. Everybody was, now like there was more than we had people for. And, so those deployments, there was a little bit of the support stuff, but then that's when, and General McChrystal, I credit him with a lot of this, and him and a lot of the JSOC commanders at the time. They're like, in order to win this war, we've got to pressurize the network. That means we've got to have just things happening every single night. And we've got to be just eliminating people off the board, the leadership board, every single night, multiple times a night, as many times as we possibly can, because we can't give them a moment of reprieve. And, General McChrystal, who, was a 275 battalion commander and the regimental commander, was like, well, we got this untapped resources of all these strike forces, these Ranger platoons. A Ranger platoon could be a strike force. It doesn't need to be a company. Figure it out. And that's when things really, really started to happen. And we just, man, it was off to the races, and it was, between Baghdad, Balad, Tikrit, Mosul, and even Afghanistan, Rangers just going out by themselves, no big brothers, no other special operation units. And then, things started to really happen from gear, perspective. Hey, they need additional assets, and better gear for this because they're doing urban warfare. They need dogs, they need ladders, they need, advanced training on this kind of stuff if they're going to really truly be a strike force. And that's when the floodgates open. And that's really where the equipment really started to revolutionize. When we came back for training, it was like, hey, we don't need to sit there and, do these long 5-day movements, through the forest of South Rainier. They need to be doing what they're doing overseas, which is hits and long offsets and, utilizing helos and mobility assets and everything else. And, it wasn't immediate, but it was a slow trickle. And then it really, after the slow trickle, then the fire hose just came on. And then, you fast forward from, about 5 and you looked up and it was, 2009 and you're like, holy shit, where am I at? And I remember being a platoon sergeant and kind of going, holy cow, like, look at us now. We're literally hitting SIMO targets with all these different units, that once, we used to play second fiddle to. We're doing training exercise with them and you can't even tell them apart. They look, they dress the same, they're wearing the same equipment, they're doing the same movement techniques. I'm not going to sit there and say a Ranger private's the same as a Delta Force operator. That's not what I'm saying at all. But you really, really started to see it. And I'm, as a Ranger platoon sergeant, I couldn't believe, even though, I'd grown up, through all this, because I really came of age in the war. I really did. I was a team leader, and I, became a, squad leader, platoon sergeant, first sergeant, all this stuff. But I just remember being like, I cannot believe the amount of control I have over my area of operation, my jock, my battle space. If somebody wants to go out on a mission, they got to call me. General Crystal would call me, or his aide would call me and be like, hey, I want to go out on target tonight. And I'd be like, well, sir, I don't know. It's kind of a tight helo. You don't have a lot of room, but I suppose I can bump a guy so you can come, like, I'll do you a solid, but hey, I've been really eyeing these new titanium ladders. Can you talk to Sergeant Major Nacy about it? And he's like, well, I like the way you think, and, and that's how shit happened, and it was just, and we had intel, we had dogs, we had, TSE elements. We just had all this different kind of stuff that we just improved our capabilities with, through it. And we did it really rapidly. We trained with it faster, and then we proofed the concept and made it happen in war.
Mm-hmm.
That's
wild. No, that's amazing. Like I said, seeing the development of that is, only getting more lethal. It's nice to see. We had this weird phase, going from Vietnam to, going through the phase. You had, some smaller skirmishes, in the 90s, and then like the GWOT kicks off. But then it's still, for us in the Marine Corps, especially infantry, those are for us is two different wars. We're in the mountains in one, and then we're in the cities in another. So you're urban and then you're mountain warfare. Yeah, completely different mentality, completely different fighters. And I feel like some people confuse that, but even with you guys, it's like, oh no, Rangers sharpen their skills. They, you guys are, running and gunning with tier 1. You guys can handle yourselves within that, and be trusted, and that's what I heard with guys, exactly what you were saying with guys that were impressed. You're looking back on the years, but they're like, hey, one of the biggest, I was having a conversation with guys I was on a shoot with, and one was retired SF, but he was talking about, he was Rangers back in the 90s and then went SF, but he was like, one of the biggest beneficiaries of GWOT was Rangers. He was 100%. What they can do now is wild. They have intel assets, they have dedicated everything, and it's super impressive. So then, GWOT is at its height, eventually what goes up must come down. What was those drawdown, I don't say drawdown years, because, but Iraq finishes up in 11, Afghanistan kind of revs up there about, or at least back in the news from 9 to 12. And then it starts to, it just kind of almost been the peacetime, even though we're at war.
Yeah, no, I know
A lot of things slow down, and you like said, you lived through that. So like to the height of it, now you're back, started at the low, went to the height. Now you're, back into the valley of, what is a peacetime Ranger? What is the assets? I mean, I know there was some stuff in Syria, but that's not big, that's not a lot, that's like rotations out, what's that like then now? I know you're retired, but what was like handling that where guys are joining, like, let's get into the fight. And you're like, hey man, those years might be a little bit behind us.
Yeah, it was super interesting. And, there's things that we'll talk about, like when we get together, and, we'll talk about how like, those years ruined Rangers in some ways, because guys would come in, like you said, they start coming in like 12 or even 11, or 13 or after that. And they're like, wait, this isn't what I was seeing. Like, what's going on here? Like, why are we not doing anything, when we deploy, like, or maybe like one mission a month, like what the heck's going on? It's like, hey, you missed the heydays, bro. Like, sorry for you, blame your mom, she should have had you sooner.
Yeah.
But, I was afforded a unique perspective, and I'll give you a little context. So, 2008, I'm a Ranger platoon sergeant. I'm on my third deployment as a Ranger platoon sergeant. I'd been on every single deployment 275 had been on, and to that point, I was one of the few guys that had. And I talked to the battalion sergeant major, and the plan was after that, the deployment we were on, he was like, hey, when we get back from this, like basically, you're going to miss the next deployment. You got some things you need to do. Because at the time, I've been in E7 for almost 3 years, and I still hadn't been to SLC, which is the senior leader course. Well, you're supposed to do that before you're in E7, and I still hadn't done it. So there was no way I was going to be able to get promoted to master sergeant. And make a very long story short, he kind of tried to, flip-flop some things on me, and I'd made a bunch of plans, and he's like, you're deploying. And then when you get back from this deployment, you're going to go over and you're going to take another platoon, and they're actually got a contingency deployment that are going to immediately go on. And I'm, at this time I had 2 kids, all this different kind of stuff. And I'm like, I don't think I'm going to do that. Nope. Just like you talked about earlier, the Army's always got options. And when you're in special operations, you're in Ranger Regiment, 2 years is your obligation that you owe. After that, you can leave whenever you want. Most guys don't, and most guys shouldn't. But, I was at that point, I was like, man, I really need a break. Like, I need a mental break. I've been in this like significantly, and, there's some fractures starting to develop, and I was like, I needed a break. So I actually went from later part of 2009 till 2011 and taught our OTC up at the University of Washington. So it was right up the road from Ranger Regiment. So I was very attuned with what was going on, but I saw the shift. And I saw it from the outside, and I saw how things changed. And we still lost some Rangers. Don't get me wrong. Chris DeMay was killed during that time. McDowell was killed during that time. I mean, we were still getting it on, but it was very, very different. It wasn't the same op tempo. It was very, very different mission set. And then I came back in 2012, and it was extremely different. And I'd stayed in touch, and I'd stayed in the sphere, so to speak. But my first deployment in 2012, back after, kind of almost a 2-year break, I was, and it was to Afghanistan. I was a liaison basically. And I was like, what in the fuck is going on here? Like, why is it so hard for us to get out on target? Like, why do we have to do all this stuff? Why do we have to get all, like, basically it was like a warrant procedure. You had to get all these warrants and approval and consent, they call them concurrence memos done, signed off by the Afghani leadership, and then the military leadership and the battle space owner. And that's actually like what I had to do as a liaison. And I'm like, oh my God, what happened to TSTs? Like, where we'd find out about something and we're rolling out of the gate in 30 minutes. It takes like a week for anything to happen, It was absurd, and a lot of the guys that I'd worked with and had served with were now in higher level positions, and I was just seeing the frustration, like, because they knew what it felt like, and they just wanted to get out and get it on, and it was just very different. And that's what I was talking about earlier. It kind of like broke a bunch of, generation of Rangers, because they're just finally like, man, F this. Like, this is not what it used to be, and I'm gonna go find something else to do. I'm gonna go be a contractor. I'm gonna go to SF. I'm gonna go to Delta, or, I'm gonna get out and I'm gonna, to pursue, a different career in the civilian side. And that's okay. That's the way things go. But the other thing that I saw too was a lot of leaders were not able to make that shift because, in Ranger Regiment and the expectations that were thrown on us and how much we had to adapt and we had to change and we had to take the fight to the enemy and how we just had to continue to move the ball forward. And it took a special kind of mindset. It was very aggressive. It was very hard charging, and you had to be switched on and, firing on all cylinders and fucking permeating testosterone, out of your pores at all times, to be able to keep that pace, especially when you're in a leadership position. And then all of a sudden, you just had to turn that off. And now you got to have a different mentality, and have different conversations with guys like, hey, stay motivated. We're going to get a target, all this different kind of stuff. And honestly, a lot of guys, they got themselves in trouble, or they just, they weren't able to make that shift as a leadership and what was required of them at the senior echelons, and they just weren't able to do it, and they got out. I was lucky because I went to ROTC. That made me shift gears completely. That was a completely different thing. And I'm not going to sit there and say that I was good at it at first. It took me a while to settle into that, because it was absolutely insane. Just imagine this. I come back from a deployment, fire breathing. I'm on fucking fire, right? And I make this rapid decision. I'm going to ROTC. I show up to the university for the day that I'm supposed to report. No one's there except for the secretary, the civilian secretary that actually works for the university. And she's like, hey, can I help you? And I'm like, yeah, Sergeant First Class Burke. I'm reporting in. I'm supposed to be linking up with, I don't remember who the PMS was at the time. And Daniels, it was Lieutenant Colonel Daniels. I'm supposed to be reporting to him. And she's like, oh, yeah, he's going to be gone for next 2 months. He's going to LDAC, and then he's taking some leave, and he's traveling with his family, across the Southwest. She's like, no one's really going to be here. I'm like, well, did they leave anything for me to do? And she's like, yeah, they kind of left a folder in your office. You can go check that out. And now I'm like, what the fuck am I supposed to do with my time? And I'm not bullshitting you. I literally was that dude, that veteran, almost kind of like a veteran sitting in my uniform up at a, university, a very liberal university, by the way, in my office, just what am I supposed to do with my hands? And I was making up stuff to do. And then eventually, I think after the second or third week, I was just like, fuck this, man. I'm showing up for PT at 06, and leaving at 5 or 6 at night. And then after a while, it's just what the hell, man? What am I doing? And I would take 4 days, every weekend. I would come in, I'd bring my kids in and take them all over Seattle and stuff like that. But it was a culture shock from hell, but it was really, really good for me because I couldn't hurt anybody. I was, there was no one to affect. I wasn't in charge of anybody at the time, and so I had a couple months, and then cadets showed up, and that was super awesome, and now I had training, and they were like sponges, and they looked at me, they're like, oh my God, there's this guy, he's got all these deployments under his belt. They're aspiring to be future officers. So it's just amazing, so when I came back, I downshifted. I was in a very different space. I hadn't kept that pace and that mentality and those surroundings and those people and everything else. So when I came back in 2012, obviously I got amped back up once I got into the environment, but I was able to de-escalate things in my mind very differently than a lot of guys that just stuck around and slowly downshifted without even realizing it.
Yeah. It's cool to hear you say that, because I think guys need that time away, but you weren't fully away. And I think that's what gets guys in trouble.
100%.
And, I was fortunate enough. So I told guys for years, I'm like, and I told other guys, my buddies, when I got out, I was like, look, man, I'm going to go contract, but I'm going to tell you right now, I still feel part of the mission. I'm making 13 to 15 grand a month, and I can quit whenever. And it's just you're still in the mission, but you're making your own decisions, if that makes it. You have control. Yeah. And I think that was good for, for you, because you're still part of the mission, you're still active, Rangers is right down the road. You're still
Yep.
talking with buddies, but you can kind of step away for just, yeah, for you, you went back, but for me, it was like, you do that. Most guys that do just get out and we're done, or they step away and it's just like, you do a total cutoff. It's like, no, man,
Yep.
I did 5 more deployments, my last firefight was my last, the last rotation with Blackwater, so it was like, but you slowly step away, but you can still be a part of the mission, and I feel like, you just can't just like shut the car off. You just kind of downshift.
You got to find something to take up that
exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. Got to fill that with something else, and then something that's not destructive. But that's why, when we were in Afghanistan, we had Rangers, we had everybody. Like I said, as a contractor in 2012, I was there in 2012, 2013 as well, and it's like, everyone's like, oh, trying to be a smart ass. Why are you here? And it's like, dude, I still feel part of the mission. Like, I don't know, like we're still in a combat zone. It feels great. Yeah. We're not the strike force. We're not in the valleys patrolling as much as we want to, but you still have like a sense of purpose in what we were doing,
What year did you start contracting?
2010. So yeah, I got out at the end of 2009 in November, and then by February I was back in Afghanistan contracting. Actually, it was metal detectors was the first one, so it was pretty awesome. Actually, ironically, wasn't sexy. Buddy called me up, was like, hey, can you leave in like a month? Not even that. It was like 3 weeks, and I had a bunch of other contracts that I was trying to be an advisor. So I was holding out for that. Like a triple canopy was like, call me every day. They're like, hey, can you be a sniper? As a sniper, they're like, we need you to be a DDM. Can you come? When can you come? Can you come? And I'm like, I was holding out for the border patrol advisors because they were still getting into firefights and they're getting paid really well on the Afghan. It would take you to the Afghan border.
Yeah, fair enough.
So about a month or two goes by, which isn't very long. It was like December, January, and then February, like literally like February 1st, he calls me and he's like, hey, it's not sexy, but we're going to field metal detectors all over the RC East. Can you do it? And I'm like, yeah, dude. So I got to go visit like 13 different FOBs over 3 months and do metal detector training and still be a part of the mission. It was a blast. But yeah, and then I jumped over to CIA static with essentially Blackwater, whatever the hell they called themselves at the time, and then switched over to mobile protection for Kabul. Gotcha. So, but yeah, I remember those years, 2012, 2013. We saw the writing on the wall. The election, we didn't even know if we'd have a job. It was like that. I remember guys were being like, fuck, man, is the war going to end? Like 2012 was like, the war might end like next month. We don't know. Like there's, the political realm, an election year. No one knew what the hell. They just shut down Iraq, and Triple Canopy lost all their, basically there's a massive influx coming to, quote unquote Blackwater. I think they were Z or IDS at the time. And so then there's this massive influx. There's not enough jobs to go around, and so it became very like sought after, and guys were waiting almost like a year to get deployed, as a contractor. So everything just kind of, I'm sure you felt it in the Army. It just kind of everything shrunk down. The mission got smaller. And so then what were those years like then going from, 13 to retirement and kind of seeing that, I don't know. I don't say the last breaths of the GWOT,
It was definitely interesting. I will say that, at that time, in Ranger Regiment, I was a senior leader. I came back. I was a master sergeant. Shortly after that, I was a first sergeant. So, like you said, we saw the writing on the wall, and we knew that we needed to stay relevant. We built up all this momentum. We built up all this respect in the community, across, the military. So we had to find a way to stay involved. Otherwise, we might see, and it's happened, you have to understand in Ranger Regiment, our history is after every conflict, they get stood down. Through the history of the United States military, they stand up a Ranger element, either battalions, platoon, companies, like in Vietnam and stuff like that. And then when the conflict's over, they disband the Ranger Regiment. Now we'd been stood up in 1974. We were, was considered modern Ranger Regiment, but, that sticks, it's in the DNA. Like, hey, if we don't find ways to stay relevant, maybe they won't disband the Ranger Regiment, but maybe they'll start to take away some of the things that we've built. some of the missions that we built, the equipment that we built, the assets, all this different kind of stuff, the capabilities that we built. So we've got to find ways to get involved. And that's where we saw Ranger Regiment, starting to do all different kinds of stuff with CCT, or not CCT deployments, combined arms, training, exercises and stuff like that. Like I went and I took my entire company to your guys' mountain warfare school down in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And we did the entire month down there with first Marine Division. And, it was a great time. That was such a phenomenal time. But again, that was about showing the capabilities, showing what Ranger Regiment does, and another time I could tell you an amazing story about me and, this battalion commander, this Marine battalion commander, and like he looked at me like I was an idiot because he's like, why is it first sergeant talking to me? Well, bro, I kind of happen to know what I'm talking about here, because I didn't know how Marine first sergeants and sergeant majors worked. I had no idea. No one had ever explained that to me. I didn't realize your guys' warrants were the tactical, the tactical extras of the company. I didn't know that until that deployment. So anyway, the point being is, we got involved and we got busier, really, to be honest with you, not only with all these different training exercises we did across the globe, but then also finding ways and involvements in other, conflicts and other, areas of operation and other missions that we normally, really kind of weren't doing, in smaller teams, AFO missions, all this different kind of stuff across the globe. And Ranger Regiment, man, I'll tell you what, now, 2025, they're busy, man.
That's good. That's good to hear. Yeah.
They're out the door. I was talking to one of the battalion sergeant majors, who's a guy that, I've known forever, raised him, from when he was a pup. And then, we were planning on meeting up. We were planning on linking up because we're not that far away. And he's like, hey, nope, not linking up. I'll call you probably this summer. I'm like, oh, shit. Okay. All right. Well, stay safe, have fun. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. And he's like, yeah, that doesn't really fucking mean much. But he's like, but I mean, the point is like, it's really, really, really active, and they've solidified their place and their capabilities and everything else. And, we had ups and downs, don't get me wrong, from 2014, through, to the present day. But Ranger Regiment has really demonstrated, what they're capable of doing, and also that they truly are the standard bearers for the Army. I mean, you look at 2024, every Army competition that the Ranger Regiment was able to enter it. Not only did they win first place, but most of them they took second place, third place, and fourth place. In like all the major competitions. Shit, they went out to like a Marine sniper competition and took fucking first place.
But I can speak on the sniper ones. It's hilarious because everyone's like, the Marine Corps Scout snipers are the best, and it's for years before when it comes operationally, but when it came to the competition, we would always finish like 10th, and then it was always a National Guard team. And I think I just see the Rangers did win it like this year, but it's hilarious because everyone's like, what the fuck is a National Guard team? But if you know the Army and the Guard, they put those motherfuckers on orders for like 6 months, like leading up. So they are like,
or they're former fucking Delta dudes, is what it is.
Yeah. Like Army National Guard is just swiping the floor with everybody at the sniper competition, and I remember that too. I mean, I ran as some guys that were helping run it, and the snipers. Like, I actually had some guys I served with that went there, and they barely place, but it's funny, but that's cool though. I mean, like you said, the Rangers are changing in that direction, and I feel like, especially in today's, battlefield, we probably talk about that for hours too, but, with, everything popping off in Ukraine, I've been a part of when the invasion happened, I went in to go help, and we've always kept contact with a lot of Western fighters, guys that are from our cloth have gotten over, and, the stuff that they've done and they've gotten into is insane, but it is kind of making our military kind of relook at how we're doing things, and it really opens the eyes up like, hey man, like, conventional warfare is still the main beast, it's still there,
Well, and that's where Ranger Regiment is much like the Marine Corps. Like, you think about it, let's say we want to test a new piece, like, I'll example, the rifles that you guys were testing around the 2014-15 time frame. Like, a whole battalion or a couple of battalions, like outfitting them with that so you guys can test it. It's not a big deal. It like actually doesn't cost that much money. Well, in the Army, it costs a shitload of money. If you're going to field the entire Army with a new fucking rifle, like that's a lot of money. And that's where Ranger Regiment was designed. Ranger Regiment was designed for a couple different things. One was to be the standard bearer, show everybody what right looks like, so then they take that out to the rest of the Army. That was part of Abrams' Charter back in 1974. But then also that we could test equipment, and it was easier to test it because you could do it in smaller batches. You had highly trained people that were doing high volumes of stuff, and putting that equipment through the paces. And also it was a hell of a lot cheaper. So therefore they could go, yep, this is a good piece of equipment, and then they could issue it out to the Army. Well, same with tactics, same with technology. And it's really, really kind of accelerated because of the GWOT, but then also now, especially in the technology space, I mean, Rangers are leading the way. Yeah, I know that's a stupid pun. Yeah. I'm sorry for that, but they really are in a lot of the technology domains of this stuff that you're talking about right now that is relevant, or what's going on in Israel, Ukraine, and everything else, and all the technology that's getting developed there. And additionally, they're also on the cutting edge of, doing different things, across the globe. And they're able to take that back to exactly your point and say, this is what's working. This is what's not working. Here's what we're doing to adapt to whatever situations we are. And then the Army can, replicate, and grow at scale and do the same thing so that they're when something does kick off and now we need larger forces, we need divisions worth of Army personnel to do stuff. They're outfitted and they're ready to match that, as opposed to the GWOT. You looked at the GWOT, and you were a Marine, we roll into the GWOT, IEDs start happening. We're still in soft skin freaking GMBs. Guys are literally putting sandbags on the bottom of the floors, all this different kind of stuff. Guys are making, like devices to trigger IEDs before their vehicles hit them, like all this different kind of stuff, because we just weren't prepared for that, nor were we highly adaptive and flexible to respond to that. It took, how many people do we lose to IEDs before we go, okay, we've got to figure out some armor solutions. We've got to start figuring out some jamming solutions and everything else. It took the military, by and large, a long time for how many lives were lost because of that stuff to figure that out. And I think we're better at that in Ranger Regiment. They're realizing how Ranger Regiment is an easy solution for that. They can test things rapidly and very effectively because of the pace that they keep.
Nice. Yeah. And so then, like I said, we talk about hours with that. So you go from there, the height, and now you're retiring. What year did you retire, and what was your outlook? What's after 24 years, Yeah. It's a long time.
So, I left Ranger Regiment in 2016 as a first sergeant, went to the Sergeant Major Academy. The plan was to come back and be a battalion CSM in Ranger Battalion. Unfortunately, that wasn't in the cards. It's very competitive. It's hard. It's okay. It's life. Obviously, I was super butthurt and in a dark place when I found out I wasn't one of the guys that selected to come back. But I was extremely fortunate. And the reason I say that is that I got to be a squadron CSM and 2nd Cavalry Regiment over in Germany, which was amazing. You want to talk about on the cutting edge. We didn't even realize it in the time. We knew things with Ukraine because we're over in the European continent, and the Russian influence and all that different kind of stuff that was going on there. But cutting edge of a lot of mobility stuff. We were testing things for the Army that now the Army, has in place, as far as strikers go and a lot of the equipment and everything else. So it was really, really amazing. And then had the fortunate opportunity to be activated and became the Regimental Sergeant Major of the 33rd Regimental Sergeant Major of 2nd Cavalry Regiment. Yeah, don't get me wrong. I loved being a Ranger Platoon Sergeant. It was fucking amazing. Okay. And Ranger Team Leader. But I will tell you, being a Regimental Sergeant Major was probably one of the best jobs I ever had. It was amazing. The autonomy we had, the mission that we had, although, we weren't in conflicts every night, but the competition space, the reassurance of allies, the stuff happening with Russia, which I could talk days about, and, situations we ran into over there for that, a lot of stuff that's just not in the news. It was unbelievable. It was really, really cool. And then, left that, and got an opportunity, based off advice of a bunch of mentors, and went over to First Security Forces Assistance Brigade here in Fort Benning, Georgia, to be a brigade sergeant major. And yeah, it was interesting. That was a fun time in some ways, but it was definitely interesting. But, I came out of Germany with the plan of, okay, you're going to continue to serve. You're going to continue to rise through the ranks of being a command sergeant major. You're going to serve at the general officer level and everything else. And I don't, there's so many things that play into it. I can't sit here and just say it was one thing, but I was, shortly after getting here to back to the United States and, serving with First SFAB, I was like, no, I think it's time. Mm-hmm. And they say, when you know, and I just knew, I just knew that it was time to do something new, and, to explore some new opportunities. And, so, said, hey, told my wife, about a year and a half. So, early part of, 2021, I was like, hey, I'm going to retire. And she's like, oh, fuck, you are not retiring. You moved me to Fort Benning, Germany. We had a plan. Like, you're going to serve at the highest echelons. And then the Army also was like, the fuck you are. And they denied my retirement over and over and over again. They weren't going to let me retire. And, it became a thing. And then finally in early part of January 2023, I gave up responsibility of First SFAB. And 2 months later, I retired, signed out of the Army.
Nice.
Yeah.
2023, man, it was
it was fresh
yesterday.
I'm gonna lie, it's been a busy 2 years. Yeah. I'll tell you, man.
I was gonna say, that's wild. Holy shit, man. So then, what do you do in your spare time? Now you got a real job.
Yeah, spare time. What do I do? So I'm involved in a lot of things. I've always been a guy that, man, I sit still. I don't sit still well. And now that I don't have the restraints of the Army, kind of like you were talking about earlier, now that I don't have the restraints and I'm in control of my schedule, man, I'm busy as hell. So, very long story short, I actually started podcasting when I was over at 2CR. COVID hit, and we were thinking of ways we were going to, influence, mentor soldiers. And one of the ideas was podcasting. So we actually started a podcast, DOD produced, through DBIDs and everything else. It was called Kill Tank Radio. And I was the host, which I found very funny that they wanted me to be the host of it. Because I'm like, you guys realize my first language is profanities and my second language is English, right? But we had a ton of fun. We had so much fun. It was just for the unit. We talked to members of from privates, everybody. Like we talked about awesome stuff. It was so much fun, and guys loved it. But when I left, guys were, a lot of people were hitting me up, and they're like, "Hey, are you going to keep on doing this podcast thing?" And I'm like, well, I hadn't really thought about it. I mean, that's done. I mean, what am I going to do? Start my own podcast? And they're like, yeah, that's kind of what we're getting at, dumbass. Mm-hmm. So started another podcast called Always in Pursuit. And that was about leadership. It was about success principles. We did a lot of veterans. We talked to a lot of veterans, a lot of senior leaders, but we also talked to a lot of, very successful entrepreneurs and business owners and book authors, just people in all different kinds of space. It was just about their journey, always being in pursuit of, improving yourself and getting better, showing up every day, all this different kind of stuff. But this funny thing started happening. Every time I would have a Ranger on, I'd get inundated with emails, messages, phone calls, texts. Hey, you should have this Ranger on. And, I'm sitting around one day and I'm, talking to my wife and another buddy that does a bunch of consulting and graphic design. And, he's kind of, he's my director of growth now for Legends. I'm sitting around talking to him about it. And they're like, well, just start a Ranger podcast. They're like, a Ranger podcast? Like, why? Like, I already got a podcast. Like, why would we start another one? But it's so deceived. And eventually we're like, okay, let's do this. Legends of the 75th, kind of came about. And, and then eventually, at one point I was running 2 podcasts. I was a brigade sergeant major. And so this is actually before I retired, all this started. And I was about to have a fucking mental breakdown because it was so goddamn, I was doing so many things. And I was like, something's got to give. So we didn't shut down Always in Pursuit. We basically just kind of off-ramped. It's still there. Everything's still there. We had a blog. We had newsletter. Like, it's all still there. This all still exists and everything else. But we just hit the pause button on that. We went full in on Legends. And Legend of the 75th podcast is just literally about people that have served in the 75th Ranger Regiment. And it's about the culture, the dynamics, and the evolution and the history of the 75th Ranger Regiment and what makes it, you know. And it is a special dichotomy that exists in the Army community that, you know, we've basically for almost 2.5 years now tried to explain through the eyes of the people that served within the Ranger Regiment or household names within the Ranger Regiment. And we've had a bunch of success, and a bunch of success. Like it's really been well received by the Ranger community, because Rangers especially do not like to share their stories. They don't like to talk about themselves. You know, it's a very difficult thing. You know, they take that quiet professional kind of mantra and they make it into silent professionals. So, but, you know, helping people understand that, hey, these stories matter. They can impact people going forward. They can help the community, and they can help the larger community understand what makes this unit, you know, because it's a lesson learned. Because at the end of the day, I got my podcast start by doing leadership and talking about leadership principles. So of course I've carried that forward to Legends. And it's still just a leadership podcast. It's just masqueraded as something kind of different. But the big thing that's really kicking off with Legends is basically becoming a media company now. Mm-hmm. We had the opportunity to get invited to participate in a recognition and paying homage to Operation Kabanaton that happened in the Philippines in World War II, where 6th Ranger Battalion basically went and rescued 500 POWs, prisoners of war that were survivors from the Bataan Death March and the fall of Corregidor Island. We took 22 Rangers over there and took a whole film crew, everything, production crew, and, you know, basically 3 main narratives, you know, are going to come out of it. Is one, the story of 6th Ranger Battalion, the most successful raid that's ever existed in American military history, where they rescued 500 POWs and the amazing exploits of that, and, you know, how strategically significant that event was. 2, 22 Rangers going over there to pay homage, to walk the route, do historical, you know, revisits of what 6th Ranger Battalion did. And then third, which was kind of an unexpected one, is Paul O'Connell came with us, which is his father was William O'Connell, who was a lieutenant in 6th Ranger Battalion in World War II and was a breach man for the raid itself. And so he was actually like a last minute add, but he didn't know what his father had done in World War II. When he joined the Navy, when Paul joined the Navy, his dad said, yeah, I served as well. And he's like, well, what did you do? He's like, well, I served in World War II. He's like, well, what'd you do in World War II? And he's like, I did what everybody else did. He had no idea that his dad was in 6th Ranger Battalion and this badass that reached the gates of the, you know, Kabanaton POW camp. So there's also this narrative of this 70-year-old man that finds out who his father is by hanging out with a bunch of Rangers talking about Ranger shit. So we're going to feature a full-length documentary in 2026, and Legend of the 75th, in partnership with Studio Number 237, is going to release it in 2026. So, and this is awesome. This is the pivot point for many more projects. We're already working on a couple more that we're looking at going over for in 2026 to basically cover Ranger history. So it's just an evolution of covering Ranger history, just in a long form, you know, kind of documentary way.
That's awesome. That's great.
So, a few things. Part-time homesteader.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, this was an amazing interview, and obviously we can definitely do more of these. Yeah. Where can people find you? You know, go help support the cause, or go, you know, find Legends of the 75th. What are all the places they can go? Yeah.
So you pretty much find me on any social media platform, you know, just Mike, you know, just like you see it here, Mike, you know, S. Burke. We're on Instagram. Legend of the 75th is on Instagram, LinkedIn, and also Facebook, unfortunately. We got some holdouts on Facebook, so we're still on Facebook. We got a YouTube channel, Legend of the 75th on YouTube as well. And then, you know, to find all the podcasts, just go over to Patreon, and you'll find us on Patreon. We pulled our website down because we're building the nonprofit portion of that, and the film part of that. It'll probably be up at the end of the month, or back up at the end of the month. We're reconstructing it and everything else. People could just reach out to me if they want to donate, because, we got a lot of money we got to raise to get this documentary done. Or the easiest thing you can do is just go subscribe to the podcast, either on YouTube or we're on Patreon, and become an exclusive member so you can get access to all the content and everything that we're doing. So we're doing a lot of amazing shit. We're honestly just getting started, man. Between what we're standing up for the nonprofit arm and then some of the people we're looking at hiring for Legends itself, we're going to expand everything that we're doing. And we got some ideas in store. I'm not sharing them yet, but of how we're gonna evolve podcasting. So it's not just two dudes sitting across from each other. I want to make podcasts, podcast series basically into like everyone's a little mini movie. So, but that's all I'm going to share. I'm not going to share more with you because I want to steal the fucking idea.
No, that's great. It's great. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on.
Appreciate you, Ethan. Thank you for all you're doing, man.